It took you 2 seconds. I mean, oh, no, no. There you go.
Pretty interesting. Oh, yeah. This is
There we go.
just looking at
There's that.
doing the items and stuff, you know.
Let's see if I can do this.
And this are meetings with business, doing things, and the fishing thing.
There we go.
It's kind of small. Let's see if we can make it bigger.
Oh, yeah.
HR exec. Yeah. So, it's a fishing company. The president, donation towards the charity show. Yeah, of our company. When that clicked on the link, it seemed like they had something, and then this communication that comes from him for communication makes sense. So and so, and we've seen it, and Tim will use a password to access the donation site. Yeah.
Okay. Oops. That's the one.
Send it to the mass.
Okay, here we go. Yeah, what I was saying was that I was thinking back. I actually programmed my first computer. My first computer job was in 1974. Okay, I was 14 years old. I worked for a company called Call Computer out of Los Altos, California. And what I did was I was a freshman in high school, and I reprogrammed games on teletypes. If you can imagine, we had 110 baud acoustical coupled modems, and people rented them for $1 an hour. So I reprogrammed Hunt the Wumpus and Star Trek. So that's my claim to fame. But I've been a computer guy my whole life. I won a fair building a computer from scratch, an analog computer, when I was 8 years old. So it's kind of been in my blood. My dad was the project manager of the first Mars lander. And I got a lot of interesting, exciting introduction to that sort of stuff back in the old days. Since then, though, I've had an interesting career that has led to this IoT revolution. I started the first ISP, Internet Service Provider, here in North Texas, and became a fairly dominant provider. I ended up buying Sesquinet, if you know the history of the ARPANET, from Rice University. And we ended up building that company relatively quickly. In 3 years, we went to about $700 million in revenues from zero, and eventually sold this company to Nippon Telephone and Telegraph for $5.5 billion in cash back in the internet bubble. And that was several years ago. But before that, and when I started that company, when I was a scientist at the Superconducting Super Collider, if you remember that project. And so I did a lot of things with distributed sensors. I was responsible for life safety systems. So if anything, was there that could potentially hurt somebody or kill somebody, I was responsible to make sure that it hopefully did not. And we had 2,500 square miles of stuff, really bad stuff, including protons that were going to be spinning around at the speed of light. And the problem was if the proton starts to go off kilter a little bit, it can be a bad thing. Or if you power up a magnet and you've got a wrench in there, that's a bad thing, especially when it's a superconducting magnet, the kind of intensities that we had. And so we had to track things like wrenches, but we also had to chase a proton around in order to deflect it to a beryllium target. And the only way to do that was using gallium arsenide and fiber optics and sort of across the middle. That's not what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to talk about today, and just from a company standpoint, I've started 12 companies. I've sold 6 of them. Some are still running. I've started 4 companies, a couple companies in the web hosting space way back when. Sort of ties together with the ISP space. Sold that company to SunGuard. It was a pretty good acquisition. Started a company called VaultNet that was a security company back probably 16, 17 years ago. Started a company called GeoMoto, which is a tracking company that still exists. Started a company in the Internet of Things space called Sensor Logic that was purchased by Gemalto, which is the guys that make about a third of your SIMs in your telephones. And they still use that name, SensorLogic, which I like. I thought that was a cool name. I thought OnRamp was a cool name too. It was kind of for V's for a while. I was into V's. Vario, VaultNet, Vericenter, all these V names. I don't know why. Probably because the domains existed, right? And then I started after I sold SensorLogic. I started a company called Ublip. 14 months later, I sold it to a public company called Numerex. And we built that company from several 100,000 devices that were being monitored. This was about 8 years ago, to about 2.5 million devices that were monitored on a regular basis. And so that was kind of kind of an explosion in the Internet of Things space. And then I left, I became Chief Technology Officer at Numerex, a public company, for a while. Left about a year ago and started a company called Quantum IoT. And Quantum IoT is a systems integration company with a long tail of recurring revenue as a services provider, where we have a NOC here in Dallas, or I know in Frisco, but still it's in Dallas, Fort Worth area, and then we have a satellite facility down in Costa Rica. We're about 20 people. We've grown it relatively quickly in the last 11 months, and we primarily focus on the Internet of Things and doing systems integration, proof of concepts, and things like that around primarily wireless devices that either move or stay still. Anyway, I'd like to talk today a little bit about, the other thing that he mentioned was the standards stuff, poke needles in my eyes. I'm actually not affiliated with the standards committees anymore, but I was the first chairman of the TR50 committee of the TIA, which was the end-to-end standardization task force for the Telecommunications Industry Association at the very beginnings of what was called M2M, it's now IoT. And then I was elected to be what I call the cat herder, but really the convener of the ITUT, which is part of the United Nations, working out of Geneva periodically in meetings in order to get all the standards organizations around the world sort of collaborating. And one of the claims to fame of that was an integration effort that I did with Georgia Tech, a guy named Chuck Brokath. And the funny story about Chuck was when we went in to do this, and that basically was where, by the way, the cybersecurity czar for the Obama administration came from, Georgia Tech. And so at the Research Institute. And Chuck was working at the Research Institute, and I'll never forget when we went in to sign the deal on this collaborative effort in order to bring in standards relative to security. And this was probably 6 years ago. And we went into Georgia Tech, and now his office was on the interior. And if you've ever been to the Georgia Tech Research Institute, you know that the really, really smart guys and they're doing the black ops projects, have the offices on the interior, so you can't use lasers in order to listen to conversations on the windows, okay? So he had some really cool stuff in there. I won't go into the details, but he had this sign on his door as you walked in, and then the sign basically said, "Your cell phone is not secure." Okay, and there was reasons behind that, and that was the fact that he had basically lots of methodologies to be able to compromise your cell phone. Well, I just wanted to say that because I wasn't able to print out a sign today, and unfortunately I didn't find a plug over there either, but if I had plugged it in, I would have said the same thing, that your cell phone's not secure. And the setup that I put out over there that you can sort of see through the window is a thing that we call TopCat, and then there's a little thing that's sort of off the shelf, but you have to buy it overseas. And basically the setup has enough of the equipment that would be needed in order to compromise your cell phone. In fact, even if you have an LTE phone, you can compromise it. And the reason is because people don't think about the fact that it's not that you need to compromise LTE. And a lot of times, as you all know as security experts out there, that people exploit things by basically making you move down layers to layers which are easily exploitable. There's no reason to try to sit there and break a perimeter that's highly fortified if there's another way to get through that's much easier. Or you can basically try to compromise and make the wall come down. So in networks, the GSM network is really not that secure. And certainly the 2G network is not secure. And so what you do is you use that little radio, see the one with the 6 antennas on it. That basically has the capability to be able to just blow away any frequency that you want. And it goes all the way high band, low band, and LTE, and then it goes to the 4G side and over to 3G GSM and down to 2G and also Wi-Fi, 2.5 gigahertz. It doesn't have any of the higher because I've got another device that's actually in the black box. That's a Wi-Fi router. And so the idea is you basically do spurious all over the frequency band in order to force your telephone in order to go down into a different band and technology, one that's older, that you know how to exploit. And so then what you do is you basically set up your own base station controller, which now is open source, and which is relatively straightforward to do. You can do it on a Raspberry Pi. And now you have your own base station controller that's working at 2G or 3G. You have the opportunity to be able to register the network, the telephone that's being used. And there's known ways to be able to do, a lot of the stuff is clear, but there's other known ways to be able to get at the data and compromise it that way. And so that little sort of portable device over there actually has also in the top, you see the 3 radios in the top, the colors of the Ethernet cables coming out of there are important because there's a blue one, that would be AT&T. There's an orange one, that would be Verizon. That's right. That's right. And then there's a Sprint one, and that color would be red. So anyway, that device is kind of. The other thing that we did was that the question was asked to me just a little while ago while I was sitting up there setting it up was where's the processing power? Well, interestingly enough, it's inside of the OpenWRT router that's there, which is a Linksys router, and so it has the processing power to do a lot of the things you really need to do. You can supplement it with a laptop, which I do. The other thing that I do for fun is I have a place up in Colorado, spend the summers there, and for fun I try to hack wireless stuff. Last summer I saw a moose with a band around its neck. I called the National Park Service and I asked what the frequency was. They wouldn't tell me. And so I basically got out my EDIS research, now it's National Instruments, software-defined radio, and some open source code for basically writing your own radio code and exploiting it. And I was able to put a Yagi antenna up and find out where the moose were because I wanted to find some moose, and you don't find them on my side of the park very often. So these are the kinds of things that you do if you're kind of a sideways hacker. By the way, I also got in trouble, and when I was 16, I was in high school. I went to 11 different schools where I graduated from high school, but I didn't really graduate from high school, but I finally went to high school my senior year at a place St. Stephen's in Austin, and open weekends. My parents lived in Saudi Arabia, so I wasn't going to go there for the weekend. And so I told them I was going to a friend's house, and I'd get on my little SL70 that I had parked in the woods, and I'd go down to the UT Computing Center. Trouble was that I didn't have an account. And so, I had an account, but I used up because I taught basic programming at the high school because I couldn't pass their German class. So anyway, enough of the stories except for the fact that in order to get enough account information, and it wasn't illegal at the time, by the way, time on the computing system, I did some very simple, put the screen up that looks like the UT Computing Center, let the people try to log into it, and now you basically had their account information to be able to log in later. I mean, you could do that back then, okay? This was 1976, okay? And so the unfortunate part was one of the people that I broke into was in charge of what was happening at the time. The United States government was doing a thing with Russia on a wheat deal program. And so I compromised basically the wheat deal program, and they figured it out. And so they tried to hire me as a security expert. I was 16. And of course I had to finish high school. So anyway, that's kind of my background. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You spent the whole day here, and this is what it's about, okay? And so if you take anything that you've learned today, you can really break it up into those 3 categories. And I'll talk a little bit about each one, and I'm going to run out of time. It's guaranteed, because I've already talked for like 10 minutes about myself. But what I did was I'll make these slides available to you, but only if you give me your business card, okay? And I have mine here. So I'm going to put these on the table, and you can grab one on the way out. It's jsmith@quantumiot.com. It's pretty easy to remember. Or jeff@jefflisa.com. My wife's name's Lisa. She can never leave me because of the domain name. So we talked about the standard stuff, a bunch of current activities that are going on there. So why is it really hard? Now, remember, I'm talking in the context of IoT. Okay, I'm talking about in the context of devices. You all Many of you, I looked at your backgrounds, by the way, some of you I couldn't on LinkedIn before I came over, and spent some time just looking at each individual person and finding out a little bit about their background, at least what you had on LinkedIn. And it turns out that most of you are folks that do not have experience at the device level, okay, or embedded level, embedded computing, that kind of thing. Most of you are at the systems level side. And so exploitation with SQL injection and things like that, although fascinating to me, it's not really, and actually at the application layer is very important in an IoT system. I will stay away generally from the application layer in this talk because you've already got a lot of that, right? And so what I'll do is talk about unique things about IoT aspects in the network layer, of which at Numerex I had to build a cellular network with all the components of a cellular network except the towers. The only thing we didn't know was frequency. Okay, so I know a lot about cellular systems and those kinds of things and how they can be exploited and SIM cards and all this craziness. And then I know a lot about, I was an embedded programmer at Motorola, designed two-way radios, some of the first two-way radios that were synthesized back in 1979 to 1983. And with single chip microcontrollers that we did, and worked them in the frequency domain, which was crazy with an 8-bit microcontroller back then that had 4K of ROM and 512 bytes of RAM, and you did all kinds of stuff. And nowadays it's just like, oh yeah, that thing's got like 4 gig on it or something crazy. So people can be really wasteful these days. So standards are hard to achieve because of all the different aspects of IoT. It's distributed, it's cloud-based, there's all kinds of communications protocols. It's fragmented, there's no real ecosystem yet. There's basically, from a regulatory standpoint, there's a balkanization that goes across. And from a device standpoint, at the lowest layer, the devices are very limited. And some of these are 8-bit, 16-bit microcontrollers with very limited amount of RAM and ROM and running at frequencies. And you're trying to, I've built devices before, I built lots of devices. And some of the devices I have run 10 years on 4 AA batteries and transmitting, a couple of times, 3-4 times a day through satellite and cellular networks. And they have to basically, have a duty cycle of almost nothing, okay, and then power up, do their thing, and then go away. But they also have to, don't have a lot of processing cycles, are very expensive from a power standpoint. So from a security standpoint, within MTIM IoT, you have, of course, short-range wireless, the ISM band, instrument scientific and medical. You've got the device network and the application. I kind of coined the term DNA back in the Numerex days. You've got the device, the SIM, the cell network. The SIM runs Java. I don't know if you know that. It's got a processor, it runs Java. There's all kinds of ways to exploit telephones just on the SIM itself by, from a Java programming standpoint. You've got broadband networks. You've got a gateway that you could compromise. One of our folks, a guy named Andrew Wolverton, actually was at the Black Hat Conference just a few weeks ago in Las Vegas. And he went to one of the competitions, and he won it. And the way he won it was the fact that I don't know how many people were in the room that were all trying to exploit each other's thing. That was the deal, it was sort of king of the mountain kind of a thing, where you try to exploit each other. It's kick people off if they get exploited until the last person standing. And the way he did it was instead of going after all the people that were in the room, okay, he went back after the gateway. He took over the gateway and blew everybody away. Okay, and so you got to think out of the box relative to this stuff a little bit. And so web services, database, you guys know that layer very, very well. Certainly at the server cloud side, there's lots of ways to exploit. There's some particular interesting things from an IoT standpoint at the cloud because of the way you have to communicate. But probably the easiest way, because most IoT things are actually wireless, either short-range wireless or long-range wireless, and there's lower processors with not very much capability. The easiest way to exploit most of these things is basically through the short-range wireless network. And so the types of protocols that you have to be concerned about are things like Zigbee and Z-Wave and ANT and the Bluetooth LE and Bluetooth Smart, what they call it nowadays, Wi-Fi and near-field communication. So in each of these, there's a lot of work that's being done from a standardization standpoint in order to make it so that it's less and less likely to be compromised. But it's kind of an unfair fight if you think about it, because you got this little tiny processor that's primarily working on batteries, and I can take whatever size monster processing capability with power in order to exploit it. Okay. In addition to the fact that most developers leave themselves back doors just in able to develop the device itself. So for instance, on a device, you would have something that's normally called a JTAG connector. And everybody shake their head like this if they've heard that before, JTAG connector. See, that's my problem, because from an embedded standpoint, when you build embedded devices, okay, you have embedded controllers in there. In order to program that thing, you basically have to get your code on the device. And the way you get the code on the device is through a little JTAG. It's a standard connector to be able to send the code down to the device. And normally what you do is after you've, and one of the ways to secure devices so that they can't be compromised, is that you basically do like a one-time program so that nobody can ever reprogram that device. But normally you don't do that because you never get it right the first time. You want to do over-the-air programming. There's all kinds of things. You want to add features and enhancements because people have iPhones now, right? And they get new services and things like that on a daily basis that they download. So in devices, for embedded devices, you do the same thing. And so one of our, in a previous life, one of my clients had a problem. And they were one of the largest companies, part of United Technologies now, that does the key card door entries into hotel rooms. And interestingly enough, I mean, they had like 60% of the market or something crazy, right? And interestingly enough, the device inside there was had a JTAG connector on it, and they used a little device about the size of a little USB stick. And they basically plugged it into that, reprogrammed the device, it compromised it, and they could basically get in and out any door, okay? And so all of a sudden, you imagine how many, and these are not, it's not like you can wirelessly program these things and fix them over the air, and it's a hardware problem, right? And so they spent millions of dollars going out and replacing all, and nobody heard about it, right? Nobody heard about it, okay? So, it's crazy. I built lots of gizmos. Here's some of the gizmos that I built. I do, down on the bottom left is a tracker for offenders, offender monitoring. You know, those are devices that you don't want to be able to be compromised, right? Because these are bad dudes. And you want to be able to make sure that when they remove the thing, or, you know, they can't reprogram the thing, it actually shows their, and, you know, they dive into a pool, you still transmit, all kinds of craziness relative to offender monitoring devices. That has a GPS inside of it, microprocessor, it sits there and powers up and says where the bad dude is. Water sprinkler system, that's actually an industrial one, and you know, compromising that, you could spend an awful lot of money. And tell me, the fines are $10,000 a day in Southern California during bad times of the year, where you could cause all kinds of havoc if you were to take over a whole bunch of water sprinkler systems. Then the one in the middle is a heart monitor. It's actually a left ventricular assist device. This is a device where if you're waiting for a heart transplant, you have a device on the side of you. Normally you would just stay at home and, you know, jack yourself into a POTS line, and it dials back every now and then to tell that this pump is doing okay, assisting your heart. This is a portable device where we put a GSM radio inside of it, and enabled this company to be able to have a device where people can walk around. But here's the problem, right? I mean, it's got a GSM radio inside of it, right? And so, you know, this is like connected to your heart, where if somebody is able to compromise it, you're dead. And so you have to worry about security and things like that, particularly when you think about the FDA. And there's a couple of tracking devices there. I call them dog tracking devices, but those are actually people tracking devices. And then the one on the far right is a device that does monitoring of alcohol breathalyzer, and you have to get it right every time. And you have to get the data back right every time, and you can't compromise it. And then there's some other security devices and things like that. I love this slide because this is the level of security that we have from an embedded device standpoint right now. This was done in Houston. They basically compromised the road signs. Yeah.
There was also a hack last week where, you know, the video boards that do the advertising.
Yeah.
Somebody streamed Japanese porn directly to that.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And what kind of Japanese porn was it? No, just kidding.
I didn't
Sorry.
get details on that part. I'm more interested in
Sorry.
But it was in
No, you know, and this is easy to do. I mean, high school kids are doing this stuff, okay? I mean, this is an RS-232 port. It's got, you know, a GSM radio tagged directly into it. If you figure out the IP address is basically changing, but normally, you know, because it's, you know, handed out by the carrier. But if you can find it, then getting into it is relatively straightforward. But it's very dangerous, and that's the concern. Is it's, you know, it's dangerous. So this is the JTAG thing with Bus Pirate. Just give you an idea. You know, you can buy these things for like $50 and plug them in, and now you can basically do all kinds of interesting things on any of the buses that are on a particular device or things like this. So this is a compromising method and tool that we use with machines like I had described earlier, by going in and basically connecting direct to single chip microcontrollers that are on board.
Do they also do this too for like going to the mom on SCADA systems?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, SCADA is actually a little bit easier because you know, a lot of times you don't have to go directly to the board. You know, we had to worry about that at the Super Collider. We had a lot of SCADA systems at the Super Collider. But my biggest concern at the Super Collider was the fact that I mean, a lot of the SCADA systems are on Ethernet. And so your exploitation is a lot easier. You don't have to, you know, worry about, you know, the wireless networks and things like this. I did talk about my software-defined radio. This is an example of an earlier version of the one that I have. And it's amazing. I mean, the open source stuff that you can use now to drag and drop in order to build software radio. And the one that I have goes from like basically DC to like 5 gigahertz. Okay? And so, you know, give me a frequency, give me a device that works off the wireless network, and you know, I can go in and begin to figure out what the protocol is and how the data is being sent back and forth. This is a setup which is an earlier setup like that setup, and so this is basically an exploitation for GSM and in the GPRS and Edge world. And you can tell, I mean, it's a PC, it's open source software, a little software-defined radio, and you know, move on. And you have the ability to basically do some interesting exploitation, especially if you force a lot of the telephone systems down into that frequency band. I think you probably heard this story before, but there is a lot of concern about cars as I was driving over here. I have a friend who has a Tesla. I don't have one. I have a little, you know, 12-year-old Lexus out there that I love, and I can't seem to get rid of it. But my friend has this cool Tesla self-driving car, and we were like going down the highway, and he just goes, "Watch this," you know. And the lady goes, "Well, you know," it says, "Put your hands on the wheel," and he didn't. And put your hands on the wheel, you know. And then all of a sudden, you know, she starts slowing down the car because he didn't push. But I was thinking to myself, imagine if somebody were able to take over 10,000 cars and self-driving cars. I mean, and start doing crazy stuff, right? Like, you start thinking about these things.
You don't have to imagine it. We know eventually
it's going to happen. Yeah, it's going to happen.
But I think that's what happened with, last week on with, I don't know if you know Charlie Miller.
Oh yeah, in California.
Yeah,
but yeah, in SEAL Team 6, yeah, SEAL.
He hacked the...
SEAL. But I'm not talking about an individual. See, what I'm talking about is, I'm talking about 10,000, I'm talking about a fleet.
Right.
Yeah, he could see all the, what do you call it, the vehicles in the states that were on the road at that time that had that vulnerability.
So, you know, lots of craziness out there that's a possibility, and so we need to do some stuff about it. One of the ones I love, and that's in the exploitation side that really doesn't really have that much to do with privacy. But even on the privacy side, which is at the lower end of the echelon, you have things like this. This is a paper that I read out of some guys out of Germany. And basically what they did in Germany, there's a power company that does power analysis inside your house in order to do load-based fees, right? And but they sample at an incredible rate. Okay, and what these guys found out was they took the data and they were able to tell what you were watching on TV. Okay, and so it's like, wow, you know, these are like IEEE papers that are published of things that are happening relative to your privacy that we need to think about, you know, as we build these kinds of things. This is a reminder of something. I actually had this rabbit and did an interesting demonstration about 15 years ago. And basically what I did was, do you remember Second Life? Anybody remember Second Life? Okay, well, I bought an island on Second Life, okay, and I built on that island a setup that looked like a kitchen in one of my software programmers' houses down in Austin, Texas, okay? And in that island, I put a little screen, okay? And so I had my avatar there on Second Life in a kitchen looking through a window, which was a real-time video of his kitchen with one of these rabbits, okay? And so basically it was, you know, virtual world looking into real world, and the avatar walks up and hits the button, right? And the ears go down on the rabbit, okay? So it's kind of freaks you out, okay? And you know, everybody's here kind of going, oh, my head's exploding. Because, you know, it's sort of like real life inside Second Life, okay? But now, if you start applying that to what's going on in the IoT world, it gets even a little bit more frightening, okay? And one of the things that I realized was about 3 weeks ago, so one of our clients is a company called Catapult Health. They do remote assessments. We do these, set up these networks every day, 20 some odd networks at your site. And you may have done this, okay? And you get blood work, okay? And it automatically gets schlepped up to the cloud. 15 minutes later, it gets processed in the cloud. You do a little machine learning cool stuff on it. It goes down and creates some interesting information for nurse practitioners, which are remote.